Hey guys, so sorry I went MIA. Of course, there's a helicopter hovering over me right as I start to record. Anyway, it's been crazy busy here. Anyway, we are getting back on track. This is chapter 8, the aftermath. Let's get to it. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video because, main part of the chapter. So anyway, let's get into it. I guess once I got married, I felt more normal, but it's kind of like being in a black hole somewhere. It's as if part of you went away when that happened. A really big part of you went away and you pretend that it didn't. You don't know who you are anymore. It's like suddenly you got caught in half. So what you really end up being is half a person who pretends she's whole. Even though I got married twice, I had 2 kids, and I have a very successful business. Nothing takes away that black hole because you're always lying. You're always pretending. You're not true to who you really are. And so again, we're talking about birth parents, right? So they're talking about, having to lie about having this child that they were forced to give up and losing that piece of them. It's like a living death. But that's exactly how adoptees feel too. We feel like we're not truly who we are because we're missing so much of our identity. We're missing our bio parents. We're missing our culture. And even in an open adoption, which is really a marketing ploy, but we're still missing that piece. And it's so hard and complicated. All right, continuing on. Surrendering a child for adoption has been described by many of the women I interviewed as the event that defined their identity and therefore influenced every major decision they made thereafter. Since most of these women surrendered when they were between the ages of 16 and 23, the event shaped their entire adult lives. It affected the timing of or ability to pursue their educational goals, their choice of a career, their decision about having subsequent children, their parenting style, and their relationships with parents, friends, and partners. Women who said they never entertained the idea of parenting at the time of their surrender often describe the lifelong grief as those who fought to bring their baby home. Their grief has been exacerbated and in some cases became chronic because they were not permitted to talk about it or properly grieve their loss. Not only was the surrender of their child not recognized as a loss, the implication was they should be grateful that others had taken care of their problem. Oh, I hate that word, grateful. So, grateful is a word that adoptees are often told, like, oh, you're not grateful that you were taken in, like, you could have been left in a dumpster, or you could have been murdered, or whatever. And it's like, or we could have been raised by our bio families because they wanted us. Why should we be grateful for losing everything? Why should we be grateful for the loss? And the same thing goes to bio families. Like 99% of bio moms really wanted to raise their children. We talk about the statistics because it's important that it's not just one person's story. It's so many. All right, continuing on. It was never to be mentioned. It was never to be grieved. It was just to be denied. Then little by little, I started picking up with life. But I think I was filled with rage. I have to say, it was the most altering event of my whole life. A defining moment, a defining time. I believe that the way I led my life, let's say for the first 10 years after, was reckless, was without regard for myself, my health, well-being, anything, because I had no value. And it was probably without regard for other people as well, because it was as difficult for me to respect other people. It was difficult for me to trust. I'm sure people looked at my life and thought I had everything all together. I have lots of aunts and uncles, and I can remember being called nice little Kathy and thinking, if you only knew. I felt like I was a demon. It wasn't until I was into therapy that I ever reached the point of feeling I deserved to be valued. It was all about deserving. People do not have a clue what people's lives are like from appearances. Appearances are just the greatest illusion. I think if somebody feels like they're all alone, that's one of the worst feelings. Kathy. Studies that have examined the grief of relinquishing mothers have identified a sense of loss that is unique and often prolonged. In one such study, the grief was likened to the separation loss experienced by parents whose child is missing, or by a person who is told their loved one is missing in action. Unlike the grief over the death of a child, which is permanent, and for which there is an established grieving process, the loss of a child through adoption has no clear end and no social affirmation. That grief is even an appropriate response. Afterward, I was very introverted. I could not have a close friend because I felt like such a fraud. How could I consider myself a close friend without them knowing about this? And of course, I wasn't supposed to tell anyone. I was a good girl and was going to do what I was told. It just makes you feel like a lesser person because you've done this horrible thing, this unspeakable thing. I just kind of withdrew. It's like the person that you are was put on hold and you're somebody else. You're flawed. Connie 3. Anger, guilt, and depression are normal grief responses for a major loss. And though grief may never go away, it generally subsides with time. For relinquishing mothers, however, the grief may actually intensify over time. One study has shown that high levels of unresolved grief in women were found to correlate with the lack of opportunity to express feelings about the loss, the lack of finality of the loss. The child continues to exist, like I said, living death, right? The perception of coercion and the resulting guilt and shame and over the surrender. So when I say living death, right? So like they said, missing in action. When you think of it more like parent alienation, right? So your child is taken from you and you're alienated from your child, but they're still alive, right? You have this yearning to be around them. You have this yearning to want a parent, but you can't. That's what it is. Now, granted, I'm an adoptee, so I'm telling you from what birth moms have told me. I'm telling you from what I've been reading. But that is exactly what it is. And that's how we feel as adoptees. We feel the exact same way just as that child, and we want that. Even as adults, I'm an adult and I still want my mom, Now, granted, I want both my adoptive mom and my bio mom, but I still want my mom. So you guys get it. Anyway, before I went into that place, I was always very happy. Liked everybody, would talk to everybody, was a class officer in high school, a cheerleader. I was that kind of person. I came out of there a different person. It changed me. It really changed my personality. I got very sad. I was very withdrawn. I went back to school after that happened, and everybody would say to me, "What's your problem? What's the matter with you? Did someone die in your family?" Well, having a child, giving it up for adoption is like a death in the family. The only difference is you can't publicly be sad. You gotta be sad by yourself. I think it hardened me. I was really nasty to people. I was mad at the world. I was mad at my parents. I was mad at everybody, even if they had nothing to do with it. Kathy 2. The National Mental Health Association has issued a list of the best ways to cope with major loss, like the death of a loved one. The list suggests that the grieving person should seek out people who understand your feelings of loss. Tell others how you feel, take care of your physical health, and be aware of the danger of developing dependence on medication or alcohol. Make an effort to live in the present and not dwell on the past. Try to take time to adjust to your loss by waiting to make major changes such as moving, remarrying, changing jobs, or having another child. Seek outside help when grief seems like it's too much to bear. And be patient because it can take months or years to absorb a major loss. Without proper guidance or counseling, most of the women I interviewed took action that was precisely the opposite of these recommendations, some of it on the advice of professionals. Okay, pausing right there for a moment. So yeah, here's the thing. Even in today's society, we're 2023, the grief of a birth mom is often not talked about, right? At least not to the extent that it should be. And, often if I see a birth mom speaking out, it can go either way. It could be masking they're still in the fog, which is the fear, obligation, and guilt, because they're scared they won't have, access to their child, whether it's an open adoption or, they've really been brainwashed into the idea of, well, this is what's best for my child. Or they're so hurt, they're speaking their truth, which, hey, good for you. We want the truth out there, right? But it's still constantly being shut down by adoptive parents and by, people that don't understand. And it's a problem. Now, we're still talking about the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, even up to, the 1990s. People were not talking nearly as much about their adoptions as a birth parent. And like I said, it's still not to the extent that it should be. But we often see adoptive parents demonizing birth moms, that become alcoholics or turn to drug or having mental health issues. Well, no wonder why. Because they're not allowed to grieve the way that they need to. And oftentimes, and again, this is not just to birth moms, this is to addiction in any substance, whether it's, alcohol or drugs, or it could be, smoking or food or whatever it may be. Usually it's a mental health issue. And usually it's because that person is not getting the help that they truly need. They're not opening up. They're not being able to express what they need to express and be understood and seen the way that they truly need to be seen. So I just want to make that clear out there. Anyway, we're going to continue on. I got married. I thought I better get myself off the streets. This is not going well. I was just living this lie. Do you have children? No. It was like being Judas every time. You're denouncing who you are, who they are. You feel terrible. I married this man under false pretenses. Did he ever know I had children? Absolutely not. I did not tell him. I had a wedding, the wedding that my sister wanted. Everything was a lie. I didn't want a wedding, but he was Italian and Catholic, and you had to have a wedding. Oh God. Then he says, we can have children. And I looked at him like, are you insane? The last thing I ever wanted to be was pregnant. I said, I'm too young to get pregnant. That's what I told him. I was 22 at the time. He was an airline pilot. I was a stewardess. I said, well, maybe in 5 years, I don't know. But the whole idea was so repellent to me. It was all mixed up with this grief and this guilt. And no, I just couldn't. So I'm married and everything is so perfect. We go on a Hawaiian honeymoon. Everything is just so nice. We live on 40 acres of land. We built this beautiful house. We had so much money. Every weekend we were going over to my parents' house and having steak dinners and barbecues. I remember one of those Sundays as we pulled into my parents' suburban neighborhood. I just started hitting my head against the seat of the car. I was just going a little bit crazy. It was all the things I couldn't say. It was July, the birth month. So July was always horrible. Even in my mind, didn't remember, my body remembered. This really lives in your body. Diane 4. The symptoms described by the women I interviewed are precisely the same as those of the surrendering mothers chronicled in professional studies of their grief. Many women had experienced several and some nearly all of the following symptoms: depression, damaged self-esteem, persistent guilt and shame, and self-loathing over giving away their child, an enduring sense of emptiness and loss that is not erased by having other children, persistent loneliness or sadness, difficulty with intimacy, attachment or emotional closeness, lack of trust, anger, severe headaches or physical illness that cannot be explained or diagnosed, and occasionally post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by extreme anxiety, panic attacks, flashbacks, and nightmares. Now imagine all of that, and yet the child also feels a lot of that too. Right? All right, anyway. After I surrendered my child, I had a conviction that I was a horrible person. I was a horrible, horrible person, and I acted like one for many years, too. I know people from that time told me that they were actually afraid of me because I was so bitchy and sarcastic and kind of radiating hostility and anger. I have a very cutting tongue. Over the years, it's been much modified. I'm a much kinder, gentler person than I was then. I wasn't worth much for a long time. My husband was a huge dose of reality. He was a good friend. He knew everything about me. I mean, he knew everything. And he still liked me. I lost a lot of my bitchiness with him. I thought I had made the intelligent decision. I made a rational decision that I'm still convinced was the best thing for her. I can't imagine what our lives would have been like. In some ways, it was probably frigid, self-serving. I wasn't strong enough to face the idea of raising a child on my own. I came from a middle-class, normal suburban Americana. It was not acceptable under any circumstances to be a single mother, and I wasn't tough enough to face that at all. But the pain never goes away. It just never does. My identity somehow got wrapped up in having the longest hair, the coolest guitar player in town. I was so freaking proud of that hair. Yeah, I was way cool. I dressed really well and supported an entire band on my salary. People wrote songs about me. That was my identity. I didn't have any sense of myself at all. So whatever I attached myself to, that was my worth. I didn't know who the hell I was. I knew that I was not a good person, though. That I knew. Nancy 3. Although these women were released from their hospital without any documents related to the birth of their baby, some did manage to hang on to artifacts from their days in the hospital, or to acquire pictures that provided a tangible link to their child. I remember going home and then trying to start my life over with all the secrets, and hush-hush and all that. I cried every night with the diaper I took. I had this diaper and I could still smell her. They took pictures of my daughter and I couldn't wait to get them because I wanted to have something. I cried and I waited for the pictures to come from the hospital, but they never came. Carolyn 1. I got a picture of him in the mail. You know, they have photographers that go to the nurseries and take pictures of newborns. Well, I got the picture. I kept it probably 10 years. I had it in a little brown frame in my drawer, hidden away. Every once in a while, I'd take it out. I always cried and cried. Finally, we lived on the farm in the 70s. I burned it. Oh, how I wish I hadn't. I thought it would somehow get rid of the pain, but it didn't. Glory. I had a little black and white photograph of my daughter, and on the front of the little folder, it said, "First picture of life," and had little gold stars and little angels on it. I would only allow myself to look at the photograph on her birthday every year. I would take it out, and it would take me quite a while before I could even open the little cover. So I knew the cover with the little stars very well. I would study that cover and try to compose myself enough to look at the picture. You go on with your life, but you know out there in the world is a piece of you floating around. I'm not a religious person, but I would pray to trees or stars or the moon or whoever is in control to please make her safe. Pamela 1. Women often experienced extreme sadness on the anniversary of their baby's birth. The birth of subsequent children was also a powerful reminder, triggering not only the memories of the earlier birth, but also the fears that this baby might also have taken from them. So speaking of which, my birthday was actually just the other day, and I've been in reunion with my birth mom for a while. Since being back in reunion, I should say, I've only gotten one card. She used to send stuff when I was little. But I was surprised when she actually said happy birthday. Because even though I know she remembers, because obviously, but, you know, part of me was like, is she going to say something or is she not going to say something? So it was actually nice as a adoptee, just saying. For a while, I was abusing alcohol, especially during the month of June, because my daughter was born in June, and I couldn't face any part of that month. I would cry most of the month and feel miserable. My youngest daughter had no idea what bad thing happened to me in June, but she knew that June was the month. You couldn't talk to me. When she got a little older, I told her about her sister, and she understood. Out of all my kids, my youngest girl is very, very sensitive to other people's feelings. Bonnie. I always wondered where my little girl was. If she was being fed and loved and held and cuddled, every birthday I would say to myself, "Happy birthday, Kelly Maureen. Mommy loves you." My calendars were always marked in really, really tiny print. I always thought that maybe when she turned 18, she might want to find her mother. Or maybe when she was 21 or 25. Those were the years I figured. Nothing happened. But you never stop thinking. Remember after she turned 18, I started going through the bride section in the newspaper every Sunday. She could have been anywhere in the world, but I'm checking every Sunday. 8 years, I'm looking in the newspaper for anyone that looks like me. Anybody that happens to have the name Kelly, because I didn't know they changed the name. And every blonde. I would read the whole section and check it with a magnifying glass. That's just what I did on Sundays. Karen too. All right. Pausing there because more recent conversations, we've been talking about name changes. So that is a big thing, that our birth parents give us a name and they are sacred to us, right? Now, look, my birth mom, that's a whole different story. She named me with my adoptive mom. Not thrilled with my first name, but it is what it is. I'm actually not thrilled with my whole name to begin with, but I also honor my name because my middle name was in honor of my birth mom. That's what my adoptive parents did. So that was just the thing. But a lot of birth moms do actually name their babies. It's on the original birth certificate, and adoptive parents feel like because they have the privilege, or they have this ownership, that they change their name. So as Karen was just saying, she was looking for a little girl named Kelly when that wasn't her name the whole time. So it makes it even harder to find your child when their name changes. And, more adoptees that are speaking out about this have been changing their name or have been going by their original birth name because that's what it was supposed to be. So I'm just letting you know out there, if you're a hopeful adoptive parent, don't change their name. All right, continuing on. I wanted more children so bad. I got pregnant, and that's when it all started to come back to me. That's when everything started. That's when I couldn't run away from it anymore. She was due almost the exact time of the year that my first one was born. It was like I had my baby back. I just held on to her. I was in heaven for a month, but then I had to go back to work because my husband didn't have a job. I couldn't handle it. That was the beginning of the end of my marriage. That was the beginning of me becoming aware what I'd gone through. I had to put her in a daycare, and it was devastating for me. It felt like I had given her up. It felt like I had abandoned her. It was terrible. I knew nothing. I never met another birth mom in my life. I still know nothing except that when my baby was 3 days old, they took her away. That's all I know. It's like my blood runs cold when I think about it. Suzanne. One of the most common consequences of relinquishment for the women I interviewed was difficulty in forming healthy relationships with men. The low self-esteem, anger, resentment, and lack of trust they felt made it difficult. Some women dated and some married men who treated them badly. They felt so worthless that they believed that they didn't deserve a decent guy. Others married the first man who showed any interest in them because they were eager to normalize their life, and in some cases have another baby as soon as possible. I never told my husband about my experience with having a baby and giving him up for adoption. We were married for 14 years. We had 2 children, 2 girls. The only thing that was wrong with the marriage was that he drank, and it got worse over the years went on. He lost a couple jobs, cracked up a lot of cars. In the back of my mind, I was thinking, my God, I can't believe I live like with this. But also, well, this is what I deserve. I say to myself, you're no great shakes. Look at your past. It was always, well, this is what I deserve. I mean, how could I even expect to have anything better than this? Maureen, too. The only other relationship I ever had with anybody that I was serious about turned out to be a bad person. I didn't think I deserved a nice guy. The relationship was my last opportunity to be with somebody I loved enough to have a child with. So I decided I was never going to have kids, and I found a doctor and went in and had a tubal ligation when I was 30. You feel different than everybody else. That never went away. I mean, if you're normal at some point, you meet the right guy, your parents plan with this big wedding, you have a family. I knew I wasn't going to be able to have a normal relationship. Most guys want to have kids at some point. Maybe that gave me permission to do what I did. I don't know. But the men I was meeting were not appropriate husband material. I worked for a halfway house and met real criminals. I dated real criminals. It didn't occur to me that I should be dating a banker or a lawyer or somebody like that. You can't expect anything from a drug addict, so they never disappointed me. All the other men in my life were big disappointments. The semi-serious types who had regular jobs always disappointed me. Only afterward did I realize that this is a self-esteem issue. Diane, too. The only other relationship I ever had with anybody that I was serious about turned out to be a bad person. I didn't think I deserved a nice guy. The relationship was my last opportunity to be with somebody that I loved enough to have a child with. So I decided I was never going to have kids. I found a doctor and I went in and had a tubal ligation when I was 30. You feel different than everybody else. That never went away. I mean, if you're normal, at some point you meet the right guy, your parents planned the big wedding, and you have a family. I knew I wasn't going to be able to have a quote-unquote normal relationship. Most guys want to have kids at some point. Maybe that gave me permission to do what I did. I don't know. But the men that I was meeting were not appropriate husband material at all. I worked for a halfway house and met real criminals. I dated real criminals. It didn't occur to me that I should be dating a banker or a lawyer or somebody like that. You can't expect anything from a drug addict, so they never disappointed me. All the other men in my life were big disappointments. The semi-serious types who had regular jobs always disappointed me. Only after did I realize that it was a self-esteem issue. Diane, too. Another profound impact of surrender was evident in the woman's subsequent response to babies. There seemed to be no middle ground. Some women had a very strong desire to have another child immediately and were conscious of trying to replace the baby that they had lost. Others said they could not stand to be around babies. I met a young man when I entered a television set. He was working part-time as the television rental person. So we went out. I suppose I would have dated anybody at that point, a frog, a hamster, whatever, anything breathing and warm. We ended up having a very quick romance and marriage. I married this guy after knowing him for 4 or 5 months. Looking back, I wanted another baby. That was all it was. That was the focus of my life. I was married for 3 years. I told him it wasn't working, that I didn't want to be married to him anymore. Probably because I couldn't get pregnant with him, I had to go find someone else, which I did in short order. An old high school boyfriend was home from the army. He was kind and nice. I thought I was madly in love. We met up for the lickety-split. We got married. About a month after we got married, I got pregnant. I was the happiest person in the whole world. It was unbelievable. I savored every little ounce of that pregnancy. I was in absolute heaven. When it came time to have this baby, I was in such a heaven that I had no labor pain. The endorphins were so active from my psychological state that I didn't feel a thing. They put that baby on my chest, and this is the one that I could keep. The whole thing was ecstasy for me. It was joyous. It was heaven. It was totally wonderful. Absolutely, spectacularly wonderful. I filled up the hole inside me a tiny bit, but not completely. My level of devotion to this baby, I think, sealed the fate for my marriage. I loved my husband. Everything was fine, but way down deep inside of me, I needed that baby. I didn't need a husband. He must have sensed that on some level. We were married for 11 years, and then he found somebody else. I remember him asking me early on who was more important to me, the baby or him. And of course I said, the baby. I made some lousy decisions about men, that's for sure. I should have just gone with the turkey baster route, had artificial insemination and gotten my baby that way. And that's the truth. Pamela 1. Although many women were anxious to get pregnant again, others were decidedly not. For about 30% of the women I interviewed, the child they surrendered was their only child. A similar high percentage had been found in other studies of surrendering mothers. 4 of the mothers I interviewed resorted to extreme measures to avoid having more babies. They surgically ended their ability to have children before they were in their mid-30s. I couldn't stand to be around children. Couldn't stand it. I didn't want to look at babies or be around babies. If my friends had babies, I vanished. It was too painful. It was just too much. I would poo-poo it, like it was an undesirable thing to do. That was my self-defense. After I left my ex-husband, there was a 13-year period before I lived with another man. And that's the man I married now. During this time, they wanted me to go off birth control. So I had my tubes tied. I couldn't allow myself to have a normal relationship and have a family of my own. So there's this huge thing that is inevitably gone. I will never have the experience of being a mother. I gave that up when I gave her up. Nancy 3. The women cited of a variety of other reasons of not giving birth again, such as early menopause or cervical cancer. Still, others did not form the stable relationships that might have increased their chances of parenting. Some women did try to get pregnant again, but experienced secondary infertility, which is defined as the ability to become pregnant the inability to become pregnant or to carry a pregnancy to term, following the birth of one or more biological children. Secondary infertility is a condition thought to be common among surrendering mothers, and is often mentioned anecdotally as the primary reason, with such a high percentage of these mothers never had other children. However, among these women I interviewed, unexplained infertility was no more prevalent than conscious decision to remain childless. Some women did not have other children because they felt that they would be dishonoring the baby they relinquished. Or they raised another child. If they raised another child, sorry. Of those I interviewed, 5 who did not give birth to other children either adopted a child or raised a foster child. When I was around 29, I met my first husband. I wanted a family. I think that was the number one reason I got married. I found out I couldn't have any more children. I went through whatever was possible for fertility testing. At the time, they could never find a reason. There was nothing medically wrong. I did find out in therapy later that oftentimes that happens as a result of trauma. Kathy. After I gave up my baby girl, I don't know how to explain it, but it's almost like you go about your business day after day. You do what you have to do, but your heart is so broken. I never had any other children. I know this isn't going to make sense to a lot of people, but in my mind, I had my baby. I gave her up. I really wasn't worthy. Maybe it's because I gave her away. I don't know. I just felt like I should not have any other children. That's the way I looked at it. I had my chance. Karen 2. Most of the women who did have subsequent children described themselves as overprotective mothers. They worried constantly that something was going to happen to their children. Some of the women talked about the difficulty they had in forming strong attachments because they feared their children would be taken from them or they would die. They stayed emotionally distant in order to protect themselves from another loss. My 3 children from my marriage suffered because I didn't allow them to do anything. I kind of broke their spirits because I was so overprotective. I didn't allow them to do many things because I was just so sure they would die. When my first child from my marriage was born, I was terribly afraid. I was a nervous wreck, and I was so uptight, just the fear. I was calling the doctor almost every day. I just knew that this baby was going to die because God was going to punish me for what I did. As a human being, it is wrong to give your flesh and blood away. I never ever felt relinquishment was the right thing. So I knew God was going to punish me, and he was going to do it with my second born. I was a little more relaxed with my third, and then more so with my fourth. But with all 3 of the kids I was never really affectionate. I just felt somehow somebody was going to take them from me or something was going to happen to them. Christine. It did affect my relationship with my subsequent children in this way. When I had the first child that I raised 5 years later, I don't know. It's like because you've learned this pattern to keep yourself distant, it's not so easy to break the pattern. So part of me always held myself away. Part of me always holds some part of myself away in every intimate relationship. I've really had a pretty hard time in this intimacy because it doesn't feel safe. I really have to force myself to be intimate with people I love. I really have to make a conscious decision. It doesn't come naturally. Anne. Quite a few women reported that they had problems with intimacy in general. Some women felt they were afraid of closeness in all of their personal relationships. A few described going through their entire lives feeling somewhat numb. For a long time afterward, I was really emotionally closed down. I definitely got a lot of life going, but it took me a long time to do it. I really don't want to be too involved with anybody. For one thing, it just leaves you too vulnerable. And so in kind of self-protective way, I vowed that I would never get in that position again. I would never be that dependent on anybody again for my emotional happiness or for my direction. I think it was a necessary position to take up, and it certainly got me through, but it always becomes a little dysfunctional after a while, so eventually I did, need people. That was hard. So to sort of come back to the center again, Deborah, I think one way of it being detrimental to me is that the things I should feel very excited about, I can't really feel them. I know I'm excited, but I'm not in touch with my feelings. I'm detached from a lot of them. I know I should be closer to. I just can't respond the way I'd like to because, I don't know, maybe I feel I was nullified or just not considered a person. I just wasn't considered a person worthy of receiving help to keep her child. Carol, too. I got my bachelor's degree. I got married. I got a job. I got a master's degree. I kept going to school, and I worked with emotionally disturbed children. It's like I had to work with the hardest kids, put in the most hours, and keep doing and doing and doing, which is what I did for most of my life. I just kept doing, but something was missing. There was a whole part of me, the emotional, compassionate part of me, that was just simply dead. I lacked a real deep ability to feel and have compassion for people. I just couldn't. I had closed it off entirely. It was easy to be compassionate with strangers. It doesn't require the ongoing, deep intimacy, especially if it's a stranger. You do something for once and walk away. But an ongoing kind of compassion and intimacy, that's the kind I would close out, because it could hurt. There was nothing I could do except blame myself for not being a good enough person. Something was wrong with me, and that's how it went for 30 years. Glory. Many women become very successful in their careers, but in retrospect felt that their drive to overachieve was an attempt to keep themselves too busy to think deeply. Others felt they needed to excel in order to prove to their family or to themselves that they were not the failures they had been made to feel they were. I did go on, but I kind of went on by myself. There's always this kind of depression, this sadness, but I never addressed it. I never paid much attention to it. I've always been able to join, I was always able to join, was always able to just to just be pretty functional. In fact, overly functional. I would be overly busy and I could juggle. I didn't want to go to school. I wanted to go to Cal Poly. I didn't just want to get a degree. I wanted to get an engineering degree. I started running. I had to run marathons. It was like, look at me. I'm really good. I'm spectacular. I can do this. I can do this. I can do this. There's nothing wrong with me. I was just out to prove that constantly over and over again. And I still do that. Suzanne. Some women thought that they had coped fairly well, but they developed reoccurring dreams or physical ailments that could not be suppressed. In some cases, they did not connect their symptoms to their surrender experiences until they were reunited with their child years later, and the symptoms disappeared. I developed a nightmare that stayed with me until I found her. The dream is I'm at the hospital on the freight elevator. I'm trying to find her. I'm going up and down the floors. I get off, but there's nothing there. No people, no nothing. So I get back on. Over and over again, I'm trying to find her, up and down, and never any relief. Just searching, frantic, always frantic. That dream went on for years. I found her when she was 22, and we met when she was 25. The dreams started subsiding somewhere in that time period. Barbara. About a year and a half ago, I started having this dream about a baby in a grave. I don't dream, or if I do, I don't remember. I could see this coffin. It was just a little white box, and I'm standing looking down, and I've just got this haunting feeling. And at this point, I didn't think about this child that I had so many years ago, but I knew something was bothering me. I decided to go into therapy, which kind of surprised me, but I just didn't understand why I'd been having this dream and the sense of just missing something. Sheila. I gave my baby up when I was 17. When I was 18, I had my first migraine headache. I had them steadily until reunion. I ended up in the hospital on IVs because I had a migraine for 3 months straight that would not go away. I've been in reunion for 3.5 years now, and I cannot remember the last time I had a migraine. I think it was from holding on to everything. Holding everything in. It all has to go somewhere. Connie 3. Some of the women I interviewed turned to therapists for help with their relationship problems or intimacy issues, or for answers to unexplained physical ailments. Unfortunately, they did not always receive the help they needed. Many professionals were unaware that these symptoms were characteristics of women who had surrendered a child for adoption. Indeed, since many of the women did not attribute their problems with the loss of the child, they did not always reveal their secret to their therapist, nor did the therapist ask. Despite the fact that numerous small studies in the fields of clinical social work, nursing, family studies, psychology, and psychiatry carried out in the United States, and much larger studies completed in Australia, concur that relinquishing mothers are at risk for long-term physical, psychological, and social repercussions. And even though millions of women have surrendered, there is still no widely accepted therapeutic model for counseling mothers who have lost their children to adoption. Many women are still not able to find adequate therapy. That goes for adoptees as well. Finding adoption trauma-informed therapists is extremely hard. I got lucky that in my area, she's not trained, but she's worked with adoptees, and she's also worked with Indigenous, which that's my culture. So it worked out really well to have both those angles. And I truly love having her as my therapist. But finding one is hard enough. Finding one that takes your insurance, yeah, good luck, right? Anyway, continuing on. In one study, 50% of the mothers participating reported ongoing pain and suffering as a result from their loss. If this percentage holds true for the entire population of relinquishing mothers, millions of women today may be experiencing long-term problems resulting from their relinquishment, a great many undiagnosed and untreated. Some women spent years of self-medicating with alcohol, drugs, or food, or years medicated by psychiatrists before they found a knowledgeable therapist or learning through support group that their symptoms were consistent with those of other women who had surrendered. So going back to the beginning of this video, when I talked that mental health, a lot of people turn to different types of addiction, right? As we talked about, alcohol, drugs, food, cigarettes. There's a lot of things that you can turn to, right? It's an addiction, and usually people turn to those things because of trauma. They turn to those things because of mental health. And while therapy is definitely helpful, it's not a guarantee, right? You got to constantly work at it. It's going to take years. And, yes, one day at a time, absolutely. But there's no reason that we should be demonizing mental health or addiction for whatever addiction it is. We need to be there to help and support. And that's why, talking about your story with surrendering your child is important. Okay, continuing on. Relinquishing mothers are not the only members of adoption triad. Comprised of the surrendering parents, adoptees, and the adoptive parents who seek counseling for adoption-related issues. Yet in one survey, only 27% of practicing clinical psychologists felt they were well prepared or very well prepared to work with adoption issues, even though 8% of their patients were triad members. About half of these professionals had no graduate coursework that included adoption content. Okay, stopping there for a second. This is what I was talking to actually my therapist this past week. We were going back and, I have a lot of friends that are currently in social work that are part of the triad, right? They're adoptees specifically. And they're like, so we're in 2023. They're like, if we have anything to learn about adoption, it's all wrong and it's so minimum. And we always have to correct them. So now imagine, we're in 2023. All this information has been out there. And we still are constantly correcting people. That is a problem. Now, granted, my adoptive mother, did social work. She is trauma-informed. She read the books. She went to, the conferences. She went to everything she possibly could. She did therapy. And she still missed the signs of my trauma and anxiety. And she did papers on adoption. So it's hard. Okay, so I'm letting you guys know that's why I am here as an adoptee and other adoptees are out here speaking, because it's important to continue to educate. All right, continuing on. A similar absence of adoption research and studies have been found in the fields of sociology and anthropology. And in studies of marriage and the family. I have been in therapy twice a week for 6 years. It took about 3 years to figure it out. He was trying to treat symptoms, depression, trouble with relationships, a little bit of perfectionism, overachiever, wrapped up in my kids' lives, and then this isolation. I said, don't you get it? It's not about being able to have relationships or friends. It's about being a mother and giving birth and falling in love. And then they take your baby away, and it's supposed to be okay. It's supposed to be a good thing. I lost my firstborn, but she didn't die. I didn't get to grieve. He said, but you did the best thing for her. I said, I abandoned my child. How could I be happy? I abandoned my child. Who wouldn't be depressed? Inability to have relationships. Well, who the hell am I going to trust? So yeah, we figured it out. And we worked on it. Suzanne. Okay. Again, sorry, I have to pause there. It's such a societal point of view to say, well, you're doing the best thing for her. But that's actually completely wrong. What's best for the child is to be with biofamily. Even if it's, if it takes you a temporarily moment to get back on your feet, right? That baby needs their parents, their mom, their dad, grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins. And adoptees are at a high rate of everything. Abuse 8 times, substance abuse 4.7 times, unaliving ourselves 4 times, and there's even more. So when people are like, well, you gave her up because you couldn't take care of her. At any point, adoptive parents can go broke. At any point, adoptive parents can die or get sick. That doesn't mean that our culture and our human rights and our families should be ripped away from us. And it's really sad to see how society still having the issue that being with biofamily is important. I mean, look, okay, I'm gonna mention his name here. Dr. Phil, who I'm not the biggest fan of, he's even said the biggest goal is to be with biofamily first. Okay, he's even mentioned these studies. Now, granted, he's still sort of for adoption. That's a whole problem. But my point is, if someone like him can see it, I mean, look, ICWA was just saved recently, right? The Indigenous Children's Welfare Act by the Supreme Court. They finally woke up and saw it. So we can do better. All right, continuing on. Oh my gosh. Okay. I've tried therapy off and on for years. One time, I was on so many different medications for picking me up, for relaxing me, that it was just unbelievable. That was prior to me finding my son and prior to the cancer. When I was diagnosed with cancer the first time, I told my nurse practitioner about my relinquishment, and she made a referral for a couple of therapists. I saw one, but I remember not bonding with him well enough to talk about the adoption. His thing was just to medicate me. The nurse told me I needed to talk about it, and she encouraged me to get in touch with this person I just felt closest to and just talk to them about it. I thought I'd call my grandmother and talk to her about it, but I just couldn't do it. So I never really dealt with it. Carol, too. My voice problem started when I entered the maternity home. I started getting a slight hitch, and it progressively got worse over the years. When I went to school at UCLA a year later, I finally went to a neurologist. I'd been to so many doctors over the years, but this doctor pretty much had hit it right on the head. It had been a waste thereafter. He said, "You've got a nervous tic, and it happens to show up in your voice." When did it start? And I could not get it out the words, and it took about 5 minutes. I'd open my mouth to say, "It's happening right now." I can't get the words out of my mouth. I cannot say I had a child out of wedlock. I'm an unwed mother. Over the years, I went to a voice specialist, ear, nose, and throat doctors. I also went to this famous speech therapist, $200 an hour. And he said, "When did your speech problems start?" I couldn't get the words out, and just like earlier, finally I said, "At the home for unwed mothers." He looked at me and said, "Do you think you're the only person who gave up a baby for adoption? Why are you taking it so hard?" God, I hate these people sometimes. Okay, sorry. Then I went to a psychiatrist, and he didn't know how to help me either. He listened to the story, and he comes up with the idea that I should just pretend the baby was born dead and put it behind me. That way. I said, "I don't think so, doctor. I don't think so." I went on antidepressants at that point. Years later, when I was teaching school, a little girl came up to me and said, "Mrs., when you talk, it sounds like you're crying." And I think that's it. I've been crying all these years through my voice because I just didn't cry and deal with it then. Cheryl. In the 1970s, support groups for mothers and for adoptees began to proliferate. The first groups were sponsored by adoptees' rights organizations such as the Adoptees Liberty Movement Association, ALMA, which was founded by adoptee Florence Fisher in 1971. Soon after, in 1976, Concerned United Birth Parents, CUB, was founded by surrendering mother Lee Campbell. Both ALMA and CUB continue to thrive and link members through either in-person support groups or on the internet. Many of the mothers I interviewed felt alienated and alone until they were able to communicate with other members through ALMA, CUB, or one of the many other organizations or support groups such as Sunflower First Moms, Origins USA, First Mothers Reunited, and Empty Arms, an online support group for mothers who surrendered and had no other children, or one of the hundreds of other groups available. The internet has become one of the best conduits for communication among mothers because it has allowed women to share their grief anonymously and to gradually come out of the birth mother closet. So as I'm going to say this, if you guys follow me on TikTok, I agree, not just for the birth moms, but for the adoptees. And yeah, there's definitely some Facebook groups that do it. I'm not on Twitter or Instagram or any of that, so I don't follow any of that stuff there. But I will say that it's definitely been eye-opening. All right, continuing on. I'll never forget the day I saw this flyer that said Birth Mother Group. I was shocked. People talk about this in public? My God, in heaven. This was in the mid or early 80s. There was a phone number. I called the number about 3 times and hung up because I thought, I can't utter this horrible word. How can I say this is what I am? I couldn't get it out. I would have to hang up. Finally, I called and stuttered and stammered it out. And the woman very nonchalantly said, "Yeah, they meet every month upstairs." I remember going and peering into the room. I thought, what are these women going to look like? I looked at them. They were all sitting in a circle with their eyes closed, and I left. But the next time I came and I sat. It was a beautiful group of women. We could just talk from day to day things. Diane would talk about how she couldn't be in a room with a baby. Marie would talk about how she always was so afraid to let her daughter go to school. We talked about physical things, the emotional things, just everything. That was the real, true beginning of my healing process. When my son was 27, my birth mother's group celebrated his birthday because I had never done that. We had a cake, and we weren't supposed to have alcohol in the women's center, but I smuggled in the champagne. We had a great celebration, and when I came home, I had this enormous bleeding, like a period, but I wasn't due. It was like this afterbirth was coming out of me. I had to go to bed. It was the strangest experience. Diane 4. In April of 1983, I saw a notice in our local paper, Adoptees and Birth Parents in Search. They were having a meeting at the library. So I called and made arrangements to go to this meeting. When I walked in, it was like I had come home. They told us, you'll forget, you'll get over this, and you'll go on with your life. And for years, when it would resurface, I would think, there's something wrong with me. They said I would forget. When I went to this meeting, it was like, these were the people who knew. They had been where I had been. They felt what I had felt. Polly. The relinquishing mothers I interviewed who attended these group meetings or met with other mothers through chat rooms on the internet learned that the grief they felt over the loss of their child was not abnormal, but was consistent with the grief felt by many others. Their realization was bittersweet. On the other hand, they learned that they were not alone, that they were not crazy because they could not get over it, the loss of their child. But on the other hand, they realized that despite the enormous number of people affected, few outside of this community knew of their experiences. It appeared that no one other than those who had experienced relinquishment cared. Giving up my son was a seminal moment of my life. People will say, get over it. I can't tell you how many people say that. Aren't you ever going to get over it? Nope. You never get over this. Men often go to the military and fight wars, and they never really get over what they see. This is like one of those huge tragedies in your life. That's how I look at it. It's a tragedy. Tragedy, my God. It's a tragedy because it didn't have to happen. They said you can't raise the baby alone, but no one expects a widow to give up her baby because her husband dies, do they? No, it's punitive. That's it in a nutshell. You don't deserve the baby. I think that the parents whose children get into trouble should be the village for their family. It's as simple as that. When you've experienced this, you realize that every social problem is like this. People don't see themselves in the other person. They think this experience does make you much more aware. It becomes from having other people not empathize with you. You understand what it is to be marginalized. Maggie. All right, so that is the end of chapter 8, the main part. I will get to the next few parts shortly and catch up on recording. Like I said, it's been crazy here. But on that note, from what she was just talking about, I want to say this again. Adoptees are 2 times more likely to have PTSD than veterans, than soldiers that have gone through war. We are at a higher rate of unaliving and substance abuse than anyone else. And while this book is meant for the birth moms, I just want to remind you all that my page is centered for adoptees and that our goal is to learn how to do better. So while my heart absolutely bleeds for these women and all the other birth moms out there, my heart also goes out to all the adoptees and all the children that do need, their biological family or need safe external care and need their families to do better. All right, guys, I will see you guys shortly, and thank you guys for listening.